Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. I love talking philosophy because philosophy is the driving force behind so much of what we do, our culture, our politics, our entertainment. So I figured we'd have an expert on to talk philosophy with us. So today's guest received his Ph.D. from the Graduate School of the City University of New York. He's taught and lectured at more schools than I could name because that would probably take up the whole bulk of the podcast. And he is an advocate of objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Without further ado, Andrew Bernstein, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. So when does philosophy really begin as a systematic attempt at applying reason to reality?
Well, whenever we discuss the ancients, like when I'm teaching philosophy class, I always qualify what I say. This so and so is the first one that we know of.
True.
Who knows what went on in prehistoric periods? We don't have any records. That's what makes it prehistoric. But the first philosopher that we know of was Thales, a Greek philosopher, 6th century BC. Thales believed that all things are water, which is obviously is a crude error. But the thing that was special about Thales was he wasn't appealing to gods, Zeus and Athena and so on, who were not empirical, that nobody ever encountered. He was appealing to observable, empirical or sense-based evidence. So he must have noticed. They reconstruct his reasoning. We don't know because we have very little of his actual writings. But reconstructing his reasoning, he probably noticed that water was liquid at certain temperatures. It was solid at lower temperatures when it was ice, and it was steam or gas at higher temperatures, so that water existed in all three states of matter. And furthermore, he probably noticed that every living being that he knew of required it: plants, animals, humans, and so it could be thought of as the basis of life. And so he was the beginning of the scientific enterprise here, the attempt, you look out at the observable world that is just teeming with diversity. I look out the window and there's the trucks going up the avenue, and I can see the trees and the grass, and the wind is blowing, and it's going to rain later. And can you take this diversity and reduce it to a manageable number of principles? And one is the most manageable, monism or oneism. And so Thales trying to reduce the multiplicity, the endless variety of nature, to not only to one principle, but to an observable principle, water. So this is the beginning of he's mistaken, obviously, but this is the beginning of a rational attempt, an observation-based attempt to understand the world of nature. And I think that makes Thales the first great hero of philosophy.
So I've often read about different periods in philosophy, the pre-Socratic period, the Hellenistic period, the Enlightenment, and so on and so forth. Is that a helpful way to sort of conceptualize the history of philosophy, to break it down into different periods?
Well, I think it is. Again, there's manageable chunks, and where each chunk is characterized by certain specific qualities or traits. So in the pre-Socratic period, before we get to Socrates, obviously, to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, there are certain basic questions that the philosophers were wrestling with. What one is the question of the one and the many. And we were just discussing that with Thales, Michael. Is there one principle or one substance that can explain all things? Or maybe to take maybe to take a more modern example. If we look at insects, plant life, animals, humans, and today we know about germs, microbes. They're very, very different kind of things.
Yeah.
And yet they all share something important. They're alive. they're organisms. And so what is the essence of that oneness, that all life, has in common, by virtue of which they're alive? So the one of the many was one of the two major problems of pre-Socratic philosophy, and then the second one was the problem of change. I mean, if all things are water, how does it manifest itself as very non-watery kind of things? Water is wet, even when it's ice. It's generally slick, and when it's steam, it's moist. How does it turn into things that are not wet? Like sand, let's say, on a hot summer day, it's not wet; it's very, very dry. How does wet become non-wet? How does X become non-X? There seems to be a logical contradiction there. So the problem of change was a second major problem during pre-Socratic philosophy. So I think it does make sense to talk about the philosophers from Thales up through Protagoras and the Sophists and Democritus and the Atomists, to talk about that as pre-Socratic philosophy is united by certain essential concerns.
Okay, so we've got from the beginning this attempt sort of to be able to reduce everything, all of existence, to a unitary substance, for lack of a better
or at
word.
least a manageable number of principles. It doesn't have to be oneness, but
sure,
small.
And then they want to figure out how to change, and then of course, I mean, the philosophy takes off. What I would like you to do, and it's probably going to be a bit, well, maybe it won't be challenging. You are a very bright guy. It'd be challenging for me, but what I would like you to do is to take us through just the major periods. Obviously, don't have time to isolate everyone, but the major periods, the dominant themes within those periods. And what I would like to know is who were the best and the worst philosophers. And by best, what I mean is reality affirming, life affirming, mind affirming. And obviously the worst would be the opposite of that. So we're at let's start, I guess, where you're at with the pre-Socratics, and kind of take us through. And I'll obviously chime in a little bit when I'm able to, as we go through.
Yeah, chime in. I'm an inveterate lecturer, but this isn't a lecture. This is a podcast discussion. So chime in, and it's your show anyway. So chime in all you want. Historically, very often the history of philosophy is divided into three major periods: the classical, the medieval, and the modern. Or maybe we could divide it into four. The modern being Descartes through Kant, and then contemporary from Hegel onwards. So we start with the classical period. Excuse me. The major figures, of course, are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That's not sorry. Well, congested here. Sorry.
Those allergies are a bitch right now. I know that. They're killing me.
Yeah, I know. You're right. Now, Socrates never wrote anything, but most of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. But Aristotle wrote, voluminously on his predecessors, and even though he never knew Socrates, he pretty much confirms what Plato said. Now, Socrates, the great thing about Socrates is that you know what, Michael, before we get to Socrates, we should probably discuss the Sophists, who are contemporaries of Socrates, so they're not pre-Socratic. But the Sophists represent sophist. The English word sophisticated comes from sophist, meaning knowledgeable and worldly wise. And what the Sophists regarded as being worldly wise was basically there's no such thing as objectivity. Every truth, whether in science or in ethics, truth in science or ethics breaks down. It's different from society to society, or even from individual to individual. And there's no such thing as objectivity. The truth is entirely subjective. It's all a matter of opinion, whether social or personal. Now, the great thing about Socrates is he wanted to get send it up to the Sophists. A good example, let's say Socrates is probably I think we say definitely the first great moral philosopher. he's responding to mostly to the ethical subjectivism of the sophists. So I'm just a kid from Brooklyn, so I can give you an extreme example. Some home invader busts into some family's house in the middle of the night. He's a really bad guy. He's gonna chop up the family, the sausage links, with a machete or whatever. And for whatever reason, the homeowner doesn't think that's such a good idea, and so he doesn't want his wife and kids murdered. He's got a shotgun, and they duke it out. And to make this a happy ending, the homeowner has the superior firepower, so he wins. He wins this struggle. Now, to you and me, this is a clear-cut example of good and evil. The home invader is the aggressor. He's the one who is initiating violence. The homeowner is acting only in self-defense of his life and his family's. He didn't go out in the street looking for the criminal. The criminal came into his house looking for him. So, that's how we see it. But to the sophists, no, it's not like one is right. It's not that one of these is right, one is wrong. It's just that they're different. They have irreconcilable differences. They can't be negotiated. They only could be resolved by brute force. And they battle. The stronger wins, the weaker loses. That's all there is to it. So Socrates is horrified by this. There's no moral principles. There's just strength and weakness. Thrasymachus, one of the youngest sophists, says in Plato's Republic, justice is the will of the stronger. Or might makes right.
Sure.
So Socrates is horrified by this, and to answer it, he looks to gain rigorously objective definitions of key philosophic terms, especially moral terms. And if you look at Plato's dialogues, they take the form generally of an attempt to answer the question, what is X? What is justice in the Republic? What is virtue in the Protagoras? What is piety in the Euthyphro? And this Plato learned from his mentor, Socrates. He's so looking at justice. You look at a bunch of actions that are just. I borrow, your lawnmower and I return it to you in good shape. Or if I accidentally break it, I pay you for it. A whole bunch of examples like that. And he's looking for the one in the many, if you will. He's looking for the identifying principle that unites all of these into one category of just, whether at the personal level or the social level. So he's looking for rigorous definitions. He's the first one to do that we know of, and especially focused in the field of ethics. And so I think it's commonly said, and I think it's true, moral philosophy begins with Socrates. And I by the way, Michael, as an aside here, I often point this out in class to my religious students. I said, look, if you hold the religious, faith-based ethics, that's your business. It's not. I'm not here to preach. They don't pay me to try and change your mind on this. I just want to point something out. There are people who believe that without God, there's no ethics. Without faith, there's no ethics, and that simply shows an egregious ignorance of the history of Western philosophy. Moral philosophy does not begin with the Jews or the Christians. It begins with the Greeks. It begins with Socrates as a rational. Now, Socrates was a religious man, no doubt, but it begins as a rational, not a faith-based attempt to answer moral questions. And Aristotle, another great moral philosopher.
Hold on one second. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
You just mentioned something very, very important about ethics and God. And Plato gives a phenomenal dilemma for those who argue that ethics require a deity. And they call it the horns of, I don't know how to pronounce the name. You probably do. How do you say it?
Euthyphro?
Euthyphro, yeah. Are you familiar where he poses the question where he says, does God love good acts because they're good, or are they good because God loves them? Right.
That's right. That's in the Euthyphro, right? You're right.
Yeah. And so the idea is, well, if you say that the acts are good because God loves them, then they're arbitrary. The good is just a decree of God. God happens to like them, so they're good. But if you say no, God loves them because they're good, then they're good independent of God.
Right, and you've limited God's power. Then he's not omnipotent at that
yes.
point.
So I just does that hold the significance that it does in my mind as far as demonstrating the problems with claiming that any type of morality is dependent on a deity?
Yeah, I think certainly Plato's discussion in the Euthyphro, like you said, is very valuable on this, but also the problems go much deeper and wider. These are faith-based beliefs. They're not supported by any evidence. This is something you believe or you don't.
Sure.
In Leviticus, for instance, there's that today very controversial point about homosexuality. What's the great? It's a great quote, but what is it? Thou shalt not lie with a male as with a woman.
Yeah.
It is an abomination.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's an arbitrary claim. It's an arbitrary claim. There's no evidence off it. Why? No. So proper morality, excuse me, is akin to science in the sense that you got to give evidence to support your conclusion. But religion is an authoritarian, arbitrary system, and you're right. Going back to the Euthyphro, because if God commands X because it's good in itself, then He's not omnipotent. And the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims all insist on God's omnipotence. I mean, there's something He can't do. If X, He commands X because X is good in itself, then He can't command non-X because it's not good. That you've limited God's omnipotence, and they won't. The religious people won't accept that God's omnipotent, and that logically necessitates He could command anything He wants, and He does. I mean, he tells the Jews, in the Old Testament, right, when they invade Canaan, slaughter the pagans who are minding their own business, farming their land and everything. Slaughter them, kill everybody, the men, the women, the babies, the livestock, burn to the ground. And it's just, and that's not the only example. So God, religious ethics is necessarily authoritarian and arbitrary.
And doesn't that, if you're arguing that ethics is based on religion or based on faith, that would in turn lend credence to the sophist idea that there's no objectivity, there's no right and wrong. You believe this, or whatever you happen to think, because, well, who are you going to tell me I'm wrong about what I put faith in if faith is the standard? It's just I believe this, you believe that. So
exactly.
That's kind of a big problem, it seems to me, for the entire system of ethics, if you're claiming that it rests on faith.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Ayn Rand, who I have loved since I was a teenager, her novels and her philosophy of objectivism, points out that there's no evidence for the supernatural world, and so the religionists simply, they feel it, they want it to be, they desire, it's psychologically, I think it's understandable in many cases. We lose people we love, and we want them to still, to be immortal. Yeah. We know we're going to die, and we'd like it if we were good people that we would be immortal. We like the idea that there's some judge here. There's so many atrocities in the world, and so many good. What's the joke on that? That no good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah.
There's so many good people that don't get the rewards they deserve, and there's bad people that don't get the punishment they deserve. We'd like there to be some ultimate justice in the world, even if it's after death. So all that's many people have a desire for this, but there's no evidence that it's anything more than a desire or a fantasy. And so the whole thing, as Ayn Rand points out, is as subjective as the sophist example with the the homeowner versus the home invader. They're going by their feelings. And again, it does reduce to a form of might makes right. God's more powerful than us in their view. He could will anything he wants, and he does. And he does. Many brutal stories in the Bible and the Quran.
He turns a woman into salt for turning around. For what I mean, come on.
Yeah, he kills. I think it was 3,000 of the Hebrews. Moses and his brother killed 3,000 Hebrews when he comes down, from Sinai with the 10 Commandments, because they're worshiping a golden molten calf, in defiance of Commandment 1. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, which they have not yet received.
I never considered that. Wow, that's true. Wow.
I mean, the injustice of that is just extraordinary.
Yeah, for sure. All right, before I got you, I took you down that road. You were arriving at Aristotle.
Yes.
So tell us about Aristotle.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, Aristotle credits Socrates with being Aristotle's the amongst his other great achievements is the father of the field of logic, and which is enormously important and original on his part. He credits Socrates for being the first one to look for rigorous definitions, which is part of logic. But we haven't discussed Plato. Do you want to go right to Aristotle, or should we discuss Plato?
I thought that's where you wanted to go. You can go, we'll go sequential. Sure, go to Plato first.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense to go that way. Now, Plato does a lot of great things. In his career, he's a great salesman for philosophy, for its importance. He glorifies Socrates, properly so. He teaches Aristotle. He forms the first outstanding university that we know of, the Academy in Athens. He's a brilliant writer. He's a brilliant thinker. But I can't consider him a hero. On the contrary, because of the problem of change. So let's go back to the cats or the dogs or some simple example like that. The individual cats, I have a cat, so I think cats, but a lot of people, I hate cats. All right, fine, you can use dogs or another example, but they vary. I mean, cats really a good example because they vary so widely. You got a 10-pound, domestic short-hair, and you got like a 400-pound African lion, and all the way up to that 1,200-pound liger. The cross between a lion and a tiger. But they're all, but they're all cats. And they come and go. They live, they die. They're all different. Well, what is it about? What is it about all these different particulars, by virtue of which they're all cats? In other words, Plato, following his mentor Socrates, raises the good question, and Plato raised a lot of good questions. Part of his greatness: what is catness? Or what is dogness? Or what is manness? What does it mean to be a cat? Any type of cat. So we're looking for the essence, that defining characteristic or set of characteristics. And Plato says, I can't find it. When I examine in the observable world, all I find are cats. Well, I find the particular cats. I don't find the universal, that which is common to all cats. And yet, when we talk about cats, we have some idea what they are. We have some idea what it means to be a cat. We have some definition for a cat. Today would be a feline animal. A feline denotes a certain set of biological characteristics distinctive to cats. We have some idea of what it means, but I can't find it. But we know it. But I can't find it in this world. So there must be a transcendent world, a world higher than this, where resides these unchanging, permanent, universal truths that are distinctive to all members of a given type. So he makes the leap to a transcendent world. So now we have what they call two-world metaphysical dualism. We have the observable world and we have the non-observable. We have the bodily world, we have the spiritual world, the natural world, we have the supernatural, so on and so forth. And unfortunately, you see why Plato later on had such an influence on Christianity. The supernatural world dominates or is responsible for the natural. In Judaism and Christianity, God creates the world. In Plato, these ideas, these universals or forms, as he calls it, the world of forms, kind of radiates out into space. Like catness kind of radiates out into the physical world and creates cats. But the supernatural world is dominant. So the supernaturalism, the two-world metaphysical dualism, is a big part of Plato. And notice it leads to very baleful political consequences, because Well, who studies the supernatural world? Who studies this transcendent world of ideas? Not every man and every woman. We're busy, in the observable world, making a living, taking care of our kids and everything. The philosophers study the higher world. Well, they're the ones that know, like Socrates, they're the ones that know the moral principles, the moral concepts. So if you want society to be virtuous, who should have political power? Well, the philosophers, the lovers of wisdom. Philosophy, translated from the Greek into English, means love of wisdom. The lovers of wisdom, not the lovers of wealth, not the lovers of power, not the lovers of pleasure. The lovers of wisdom must have total political power. And so the conceit begins with Plato that's so common today, the idea that the educated intellectual elite know better what's good for my life than I know. And consequently, we want to establish the rule of, the educated intellectual elite. This was the defining principle of the American school system for the last 100 years. The rest of us don't need much of an education. We just have to, be good at our jobs and obey the wise rulers of the state. That's Dewey and those guys. It's very Platonic. So the reason I consider Plato a villain, despite all of his greatness, his genius, is the essence of his philosophy is a transcendent world in metaphysics, in his view of reality, and a totalitarian politics. So
now, how much is his totalitarianism based on the murder of his teacher by the Athenian mob, right? Under democracy, his teacher is put to death, Socrates. How much does that influence Plato's viewpoint that people are unable to govern themselves and they need to have the philosopher kings making all their decisions for them?
I think that's certainly part of it. Plato was a member of the hereditary aristocracy, and he may have even approached, although Socrates was a commoner and a poor guy. So give Plato enough credit to recognize, that intellectual and moral greatness doesn't reside with the aristocracy alone. This poor guy, Socrates, was the best person in Athenian society. Plato believed that, and he's probably right about that. But nevertheless, other than Socrates, he may well have approached the every man. I don't like the term common man, because under certain conditions, the common man can be very uncommon indeed, for better or worse. But every man and every woman, he may well have approached it with a prejudicial aristocratic view that these are lower forms. They're not they're not as good as the nobility. But anyhow, you're certainly right. If he did have that prejudice, the Athenian execution, it's really his murder. It's legalized murder, because Socrates had done nothing to warrant any type of punishment, never mind capital punishment. Basically, he's executed for raising too many moral questions to the state.
He was corrupting those children with making them, teaching them how to think, though. That is a problem.
Yeah, well, he was a pederast, there's no doubt, but so was everybody else.
No, that's not what I meant.
I know, I got you.
He was, but they all.
But that didn't distinguish him from his accusers. No. What distinguishes him from his accusers is exactly what you said. He was teaching them to ask questions. If I could quote Al Gore, he spoke truth to power, which Al Gore might try someday. He might like it, but you're leaving out contemporary politicians. So that's what Socrates was really convicted of, was speaking truth to power, raising moral questions to the Athenian state, and which was governed by a democracy at that point, from Plato's view, by the mob. And so, the mob, in effect, murdered Socrates. The allegory of the cave is in part, in the Republic, is in part telling this story. So, but anyway, certainly, whether Plato came to it with an traditional aristocratic prejudice or not, you're right. The murder of Socrates by the Athenian mob, by the democracy, certainly either contributed to or certainly at the very least helped form his idea. The common man, I think the term he would use, the common man is incapable of thinking, goes by their feelings, and they need to be governed, by the wise. The 20th century American right, I think it was Dorothy Parker, who was very witty, said, quote, "The masses are asses," unquote. And I think that's a very Platonic belief. Yeah, well, Plato put it a little more less vulgarly. He said, democracy is the system in which each man is free to go to the devil in his own way. And they will, unquote. The boozers are all free to kill themselves on booze. The druggies are free to kill themselves on drugs. The sexually indiscriminate are free to kill themselves on sexually transmitted diseases, and so on and so forth. They need to be governed if their life is to be appropriate to a human being. They need to be governed by the wise philosophers.
So, how, in Plato's view, if the real world, the world of forms, if that's where the pure stuff is, the real stuff is, how do we get our ideas here? So I in other words, I see the cat like you're talking about, and I see a tiger, long hair, short hair, whatever, and I conceptualize them. I say these are all cats. How do we know that according to Plato?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. And according to Plato, we couldn't. The wise philosophers, studying the forms, they're the ones who have that kind of knowledge and of questions. Plato was a brilliant philosopher, no doubt. He developed a whole philosophic system. Part of his genius is that he was primarily a political philosopher. That was his first love, in contrast to Aristotle, let's say, who was fascinated by technical issues, biology and logic. Still was a great moral philosopher, even though it wasn't his first love. But for Plato, politics was his first love. And he develops this whole system of thought in order to arrive at the ideal political system, the republic, this totalitarian state we've been discussing. And so the only ones who could know, not just the kind of question that you raised, Michael, about cats, and it's questions of biology and things like that, which Plato didn't really have much interest in the sciences. Aristotle does. The higher world is better, right? But the philosophers will know the answers to those questions. The philosophers alone, and most important to Plato, to the more important questions, the question about moral and political principles. Yeah. That's why they're the ones who should govern, and we simply obey.
So, but the average person, though, does say, well, that's a cat or that's a dog or, whatever. So the average person has some idea of what he's looking at, right? What I'm getting at here is, from what I understand, is that Plato's idea is that we have sort of a memory of this stuff from previously being associated with the world of form. So while the philosopher might have an understanding of actually what is taking place, your average person looks at the cat and remembers from the previous world that this is a cat. Is that inaccurate? Is my understanding wrong?
No. You're correct. In his dialogue, the Meno, Plato discusses that, and also a couple of points. First of all, every man probably wouldn't know, could recognize a bunch of different alley cats, as cats, but probably wouldn't know that lions, tigers, and not bears, but lions, tigers, and ligers, are members of the same species as as these small, domestic short hairs. He got to learn that from the experts. But your point is I think is key to Plato. You're absolutely right. Knowledge is reminiscence, Plato tells us. I think that's in the Meno. I'm not an expert on Plato. Logic is reminiscence, and that the soul has. Plato believes from Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, something that is later rejected by Christianity, and that is in the transmigration of souls. For Christianity, my soul is unique to me and your soul is unique to you. But in the reincarnation theory, souls are recycled. God God was an environmentalist. He wanted
Did
to
they have a
conserve.
box?
Yeah. If you want,
Recycling?
they want to conserve resources, right? So they're recyclable, and they come back and different forms. And so, he says in a prior life, not a prior life, in a prior existence in that higher world, the world of forms, the soul knows cats, like you said, the soul knows dogs, and then we're born, I guess, if we can interpret here some kind of birth trauma. The soul forgets everything, and now it's plunged together with this low life body and this budget bargain basement version of a world. We've forgotten all the things that we knew from the higher world, and the cats remind us of it. I think Plato's metaphor is, if you look at on a sunny day, the shadow that cast by a house, let's say, it's kind of sort of similar to, in a vague, imperfect way, the shadow is similar to the house that casts it. And that's the metaphor Plato uses, that the cats or the dogs, kind of shadowy versions of the catness or dogness that the soul knew in a higher world. So you're absolutely right. When Plato says knowledge is recollection or knowledge is reminiscence, that's what he means.
Okay, so it sounds like so far we've got Socrates, who is kind of a hero as the first moral philosopher, although he was probably mistaken about it. Well, not probably, he was mistaken a lot, but is a hero in the sense that he got people thinking about moral questions.
And he's looking for objective. He's looking for rigorous definitions of moral concepts and moral principles.
Yeah, and it seems like with Plato, we take sort of a backslide to more of a subjective, although he's not subjective in the sense that everybody can have their own belief and everybody's right. He's not a sophist, but yet it's subjective in the sense that conscious rather, is preeminent, and only the conscious of some people is exalted to the point where they can know things. Would that be a good way to put it?
Yeah, he's appealing to a higher world, and there's no such place. And so we have no evidence that there's such a place. And so people have their own versions. This is the problem with all these.
I think the better word would have been intrinsicist, not subjectivist, more of an intrinsicist thing that only some people can know, that most people can't know.
Yeah, intrinsicism is a term Ayn Rand coins, meaning built into the very nature of reality. So that the concept of goodness or virtue is built into the very nature of reality in this transcendent world, and we have to access it. Now, the problem, of course, is it's in a transcendent world. We can't access it by any observable means. And Ayn Rand points out brilliantly, and it's in the What is Capitalism essay in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, that intrinsicism reduces to a type of subjectivism, that there is no higher world, and so these thinkers are just getting their ideas of goodness from their own feelings. I call it methodological subjectivism. They don't claim, like you were right, you said, they don't claim, Plato doesn't claim, like the sophists do, that each man has his own right and wrong. He's horrified by it. No, his right and wrong is built into reality. We have to access. But it's a fantasy.
Yeah.
And trying to conceptualize it. People have their own feelings and their own versions of it. That's the major problem in religion. The Jews believe this, and the Christians that, and the Muslims this, and they fight constantly, and they kill each other over their different versions of understanding the higher world. So I think Plato's largely a villain, even though he did a lot of great things.
Well, he did teach Aristotle. And
yes, he did.
You previously mentioned that with Aristotle, we end up with was where we first have logic. So a question that I kind of think about sometimes, and people have asked me, or not asked me, but I've read it. Would you say that Aristotle invented logic or discovered logic? I'll tip my hand. I think of it in terms of a discovery. He discovered logic as a proper method. So what would you say? Before you tell us about him, I'm just curious about that now that I have a professor and a philosophy professor in front of me. So that's why I asked.
Well, I think it's more of a discovery than an invention, because you're discovering, you're identifying certain principles. that are true. There's a difference from, let's say, Edison inventing, the light bulb, where somebody, Edison or some other scientist, would need to identify or discover, the scientific principles that make it possible to make the light bulb. But Edison actually made the thing. He actually figured out the right ingredients, the right recipe, if you will, how to actually construct the thing. So I think in invention is the right term. But you don't invent laws of nature. You don't invent laws of of the way the mind works. You identify them, or you discover them. So I think I say Aristotle identified the laws of logic. We discovered the laws of logic. Edison invented the light bulb. We actually brought this new physical thing into the world.
Okay, so now that we got that, I satisfied my own curiosity. Tell us about Aristotle.
Yeah, Macedonian. What were his dates? I've taught this 384 to 322 BC. So he's 4th century BC. Comes down from Macedonia when he's 17 to Plato's Academy. Stays there for 20 years until Plato's death. Plato and Aristotle were very close. Again, this is part of Plato's the good things of Plato. Plato's a mixed case, I think, but he lists because of his otherworldly metaphysics and his totalitarian politics. I think he's more of a bad guy here, life harming than he is life affirming. Aristotle, here's the real difference. According to legend, Plato had over the front gate to the academy a big sign that read, "Let none who are ignorant of geometry enter here." And part of the reason he was so enamored of math is because, geometry, highly developed science in the ancient world, trains the mind to think rigorously. And he couldn't teach them logic for the reasons we're discussing now. It didn't exist. It was created later, by Aristotle. But the underlying, here's the difference between Plato and Aristotle. The underlying difference here is that for Plato, why he's so enamored of mathematics is, let me use a simple algebraic example, even though the Greeks knew little or nothing about algebra. So I take 3 times 3a equals 9a. The truth of that simple equation does not depend upon what value we substitute for the variable a. We could be talking about pennies or dollars or apples or automobiles or anything. The truth remains invariant. And so A is not a perceptual level concrete. It's not a particular thing. It's an abstraction. It's an idea. It's an idea. We're climbing the cognitive ladder. We're rising above. We're dealing with abstractions now. We're dealing with ideas. We're rising above simply dealing with particulars. We're heading higher towards the world of ideas, towards the world of forms. And so to Plato, mathematics is a cognitive stepping stone from the world, or step ladder from the world of particulars, taking us not all the way to the world of forms or universals, but a few steps higher to help us transcend the world of nature. That's Plato. Now, Aristotle has no interest whatever in transcending the world of nature. He is in love with the natural world. I mean, he conducted a lifelong cognitive love affair with the world of nature. He's fascinated. And when Plato dies, Aristotle leaves the academy, in part because they gave the headmastership to Plato's nephew or something rather than to Aristotle, who was clearly deserving. But in large part because he disagreed with the basic Platonic philosophy that dominated the academy. What kept him there was his personal tie with Plato. And part of what he does after he leaves the academy is he's the island of Lesbos in the Eastern Aegean. He's studying biology. And marine biology was his specialty. And biology, if mathematics is the primary subject for Plato, I think it's fair to say biology was for Aristotle, and biology is a preeminent observational, root around in the
Yeah.
dirt, looking for new form of beetles, get your hand dirty, cut through dissections and stuff, get blood on your hands. Aristotle's the first great biologist that we know of. And about 10 years ago, a British biology professor with that French name, Armand-Marie Leroy, wrote a book called The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science. And he did a YouTube series on it too, which I think is probably still available. And it's right. Aristotle's the first great biologist that we know of. There's the real difference between Plato and Aristotle. The otherworldly orientation of Plato and the very this worldly orientation of Aristotle, the religious nature of Plato's thinking and the scientific nature of Aristotle. Anyway, so he's a great biologist, founds the field of logic, and I think these are the things that he really loves. Plato's mostly a political philosopher, is what he loves. Aristotle is fascinated most by these technical areas. He's great. He's probably the greatest. I could drop probably. He's the greatest metaphysician who ever lived. His work on metaphysics is brilliant and seminal. On what's the nature of reality. His work in logic is seminal. His work in biology, is brilliantly original. But for all of that, even though it's the value branches are not what he loves, he is a great moral philosopher. The Nicomachean Ethics is a brilliant work in ethics. And unfortunately, when it's the way it's often taught is Aristotle stuff of moderation, like the virtue is the middle ground between I don't know, not drinking wine at all and drinking too much wine, which makes sense in certain contexts. But when you start talking about virtue as the middle ground between honesty and dishonesty, or between integrity and hypocrisy, it breaks down. But the main, what's so original and brilliant and unique is the ethics of self-realization, of self-development. That be all you can be in accordance with human nature. That's what's special in Aristotle's ethics. And unfortunately, it's a form of egoism to go along with your title of your show, that we develop ourselves to the fullest of our distinctively human abilities in accordance with our reasoning capacity. He's the first great rational egoist in moral philosophy, and he really is great. He does, and that's what's special about Aristotle's ethics. Put a list together, and I think Ayn Rand's right, and we have the greatest philosopher of history, and the first great biologist. In fact, today, in the field of biology, Aristotle is considered, along with Charles Darwin, to be the two geniuses who most advanced our knowledge of the life sciences. Go, wow! In addition to all of his work in philosophy.
So he also talks about, he puts an emphasis on the importance of happiness, right? Or they had a different word, I think eudaimonism or
eudaimonia.
Yeah, eudaimonia. Yeah, but he's basically talking about human flourishing and human happiness as a sort of a goal. So it seems to me that in terms of the criteria that I set out of reality affirming, mind affirming, life affirming, you have Aristotle, who, contrary to Plato looking off into some other world, Aristotle looks directly at this world.
Yeah.
And he's teaching logic as the means to know things. So you're already talking about being life affirming, reality affirming and mind affirming, and his emphasis on life and happiness and looking at at biology. So he really is a reality affirming, mind affirming, life affirming philosopher. So clearly he is in the hero side.
Oh yeah, I think he's the greatest hero in the field of philosophy. Yeah, his achievements are truly extraordinary. One example of this, we could point out that famous, painting by the Renaissance painter Raphael, the School of Athens, where it's one of the most famous paintings in the world. I think the original is in the Vatican today. But anyhow, Plato and Aristotle are side by side. Plato's elderly, Aristotle's young. And Raphael captures Plato like this. It's kind of his fingers pointing upwards towards the higher world. And they're both carrying books. It's hard for me, I don't know if you can see this, but
I could see it there. Yeah.
Well, this is my
Oh,
booklet, by the way, Heroes and Villains in Western Philosophy.
oh, all right.
But it's published by Objective Standard Institute. But the book that Plato's, you see, he's carrying it like this. So, so he's like this. All the lines of the Platonic figure lead the human eye upward to a transcendent world. Whereas next to him, Aristotle is captured like Raphael captures him like this. His hand is out like this. His palm is downturned, as if to caress this earth and all the good things on it. And the book he's carrying is held like this. It's horizontal to us. And by the way, it's the Nicomachean Ethics. You see it on the inscribed on the side of the book. Is he's carrying horizontal to it. Not that anybody ever carried a book like this, but in the painting, Aristotle's like this. And all the lines of the Aristotelian figure draw the human eye to the horizon, to this world and this earth. And it's one stunning visual image. The great painter Raphael captures the essence of probably the two greatest philosophers in history.
I'm definitely going to Google that when we're done. Well, we're just about out of time.
The School of Athens. Let me say, could I say one?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, because I need to go anyway. And we could, and if you want, we could always do a part 2.
That's what I was just going to say. We've only made it to Aristotle. I want to make it up to the present day.
We may need to do part 2 and part 3.
Yeah, that's fine with me. You're great. You can do as many parts as you want.
Thank you. This is fun. But here's what I think is the greatest thing about Aristotle. He taught us to think logically, that is, in non-contradictory means, and he wedded it to observable facts. So that knowledge, Aristotle says, is gained by logical, non-contradictory thinking about observable facts, not about our feelings on an issue, not about faith-based beliefs, not about mythology, but about observable fact. And here's the example I often use for my students. In Greek mythology, which Aristotle certainly knew, Athena, springs fully blown out of Zeus's head, right? No mother. Now, Zeus was a rather friendly guy with the ladies. We know that. He was, he's often called, when I say he's the father of the human race, in his case, it was literally. He was having sex with women, with goddesses. He had any number of children. The interesting thing about Zeus is, although he was a terrible husband, he was running around on his wife Hera constantly. He according to the myths, he was actually a loving father. He loved his kids, but all the other kids he had to share with the mother. Athena, he didn't have to share; she was his, and he adored her, according to the mythology. And so Athena grows up with one parent, but a very loving one, and very logically, she loves her dad. She's loyal to her dad. And he trusts her and her alone. So if he's not holding the thunderbolt, the most powerful weapon in the universe, the only one he trusts to hold it is Athena. Presumably, when he's running around after other women, he leaves the thunderbolt in Athena's hands. Now, all of that makes sense. That if you have a child who has one parent and a loving one, that she would love that parent very much, and they would have a close bond. And they would trust each other. That all is very logical. But it doesn't proceed. It's not about observed facts. It's about a myth, and a bizarre one at that. That Athena springs fully developed from her father's head. Yeah, I know. I hate it when that happens. It's got to be painful. First of all, Aristotle's a father, so he knows. And second of all, he's a biologist. I don't think he's buying into this story. It's a bizarre myth. So the logical thinking is not connected to reality. There's no way to get knowledge that way. That logical thinking has to be integrated with observed facts. That's how we gain knowledge. Aristotle, I think, last point I'll make here, Michael, I don't think it's a stretch to say more than anybody else, Aristotle taught mankind how to think. And that's his greatest achievement.
Wow, what an achievement. Okay, where can people find you?
Well, my website is andrewbernstein.net. I have a Facebook page where they could follow me or on Twitter. They could follow me. By the way, I should mention quickly, I I've long feared that the United States was going to get pushed into race war. And I have a novel coming out probably in the next month named Reckoning. It's about the U.S. getting dragged into race war. So it's brutal and it's violent, but it's a hell of a story, if I say so myself. So Reckoning, you have to give. We should have the page. You can the pre-order page on Amazon up pretty soon.
All right. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and definitely be back for part 2, maybe part 3. Who knows? We can go for 4 and 5.
Yeah, it might be. That's obviously is a very rich topic.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
thanks for having me on, Michael.
Oh,
This was a lot of
thank
fun.
you. The pleasure is mine. All right. And my book, View from a Cage, My Transformation from Convict to Crusader for Liberty, is available in ebook form on Amazon and anywhere else you can get ebooks. And it'll be out in print form, hopefully in the next week or so. For now, this is The Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Liebowitz signing out. Till next time.